We remember the French Revolution for the guillotine, for liberty, equality, and fraternity. But the real story, the one that ignited the fire, wasn't about philosophy, it was about bread. When a government can no longer guarantee the most basic food for its people, that's when the talk of revolution turns into action. The French Revolution was a financial catastrophe before it was a political one. A story of a kingdom drowning in debt, a population crushed by taxes, and a desperate experiment with paper money that ended in a bonfire of broken promises. To understand the explosion, you have to see the powder keg it was built on, the financial system of 18th century France. On the surface, it was an empire of unparalleled glamour, the world of Versailles, of lavish balls and extravagant fashion. But beneath this glittering facade, the kingdom was fundamentally bankrupt. The problem wasn't that France was a poor country. It was that the French government couldn't touch its real wealth. The tax system was a masterpiece of institutionalized unfairness. The two wealthiest groups in the country, the clergy and the nobility, were almost entirely exempt from taxes. They owned most of the land, controlled most of the wealth, yet paid virtually nothing to support the state. So who paid for everything? The third estate, the peasants, the merchants, the city workers. They were taxed on everything from the salt they used to preserve food to the land they barely survived on. It was a system designed to funnel wealth upwards, crushing the productive base of the country to pay for the luxuries of the few. But even that wasn't enough. The real killer was debt. The French monarchy had spent a century fighting a series of ruinously expensive wars against its arch-rival, Great Britain. The final nail in the coffin was a war that wasn't even its own, the American Revolution. France's financial and military support for the American colonists was the decisive factor in their victory, but it was a fatal blow to the French treasury. France had bankrolled America's freedom and in the process had signed its own monarchy's death warrant. By the late 1780s, the situation was critical. The government was spending half of its entire annual revenue just paying the interest on its loans. A series of bad harvests drove the price of bread through the roof, and the people began to starve. The king, Louis XVI, was a well-meaning but indecisive ruler, trapped in a system that refused to reform. His finance ministers proposed the only logical solution: tax the rich. But the nobility and clergy, clinging to their ancient privileges, refused. The system was gridlocked, paralyzed by the very people it was designed to benefit. The financial crisis had become a political crisis. And in 1789, it exploded. As the revolution swept away the old order, the new revolutionary government faced the exact same problem the king had: a mountain of debt and an empty treasury. But now they had a new weapon. They seized the vast landholdings of the Catholic Church, which owned roughly 10% of all land in France. Suddenly, the government was sitting on a massive, tangible asset. But you can't pay soldiers or buy supplies with a field, you need cash. So they came up with a revolutionary idea, a financial experiment that would have catastrophic consequences. They created a new form of money called the assignat. The initial idea was clever. The assignats were not supposed to be regular currency. They were interest-bearing bonds, a kind of gift card, backed by the value of the seized church lands. People could buy these bonds and then use them to purchase the land when it was auctioned off. It was a way to turn an illiquid asset land into a liquid one money and pay off the national debt at the same time. For a moment, it seemed like a stroke of genius. But the temptation was too great. The government, still desperate for cash to fund its operations and fight off foreign invaders who wanted to crush the revolution, soon made a fatal decision. They stopped paying interest on the assignats and began printing them not as bonds, but as everyday paper currency. And then they kept printing, and printing, and printing. The link to the land became a fiction, a distant memory. The assignats were no longer backed by anything but the revolutionary government's increasingly shaky promise. It was the birth of a fiat currency, and it would lead to one of the most destructive hyperinflations in history. The result was a financial nightmare. As billions of new assignats flooded the economy, their value plummeted. This is the iron law of money. When you make more of it, each unit becomes worth less. Prices for everything exploded. A pair of shoes that cost 5 livres in 1790 cost 2,000 by 1795. People who had saved their entire lives in the old currency saw their wealth evaporate. Creditors who were owed money were paid back in worthless paper, while debtors were able to pay off their loans for practically nothing. It was a chaotic and brutal redistribution of wealth that destroyed the middle class. This financial chaos is the secret engine behind the most radical and bloody phase of the revolution, the Reign of Terror. As the value of the assignat collapsed, people refused to accept it. Farmers refused to sell their grain for worthless paper, leading to severe food shortages in the cities. The black market exploded, and the economy reverted to barter. In response, the radical Jacobin government, led by Maximilien Robespierre, decided to fight economic laws with brute force. In 1793, they passed the Law of the Maximum, a set of strict price controls on essential goods. The penalty for refusing to accept the assignat or for selling goods above the controlled price was death by guillotine. The government was trying to force a worthless currency to have value at the point of a blade. It was a disaster. The price controls created even worse shortages, as producers had no incentive to sell their goods at a loss. The terror wasn't just a political purge. It was a desperate, violent attempt to manage a financial collapse that the government itself had created. The guillotine became a tool of economic policy, a terrifying admission that the revolutionary dream had failed to solve the one problem that started it all: the economy. By 1796, the assignat was so worthless that the government gave up. The printing plates were publicly destroyed, and the currency was abandoned. It had become cheaper to use the colorful banknotes as wallpaper than as money. The period that followed, under a government known as the Directory, was marked by corruption and instability. But it eventually managed to restore some semblance of order by introducing a new currency, the franc, which was backed by gold and silver. This return to a metallic standard finally tamed the hyperinflation that had ravaged the country for years. This financial chaos is the key to understanding the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. When he seized power in 1799, the French people were exhausted. They were tired of political instability, but more than anything, they were tired of economic chaos. Napoleon was a military genius, but his most important early victories were not on the battlefield. He created the Bank of France, stabilized the currency, and restored faith in the financial system. He understood what the revolutionaries had forgotten: you cannot have a stable nation without stable money. The story of the French Revolution is a timeless and brutal lesson in financial history. It shows us that an unfair and unsustainable tax system will eventually lead to social collapse. It is the ultimate case study in the dangers of hyperinflation. A powerful demonstration that when a government tries to solve its debt problems by simply printing money, it unleashes a destructive force that can tear a society apart. And it is a chilling reminder of how quickly economic desperation can lead to political extremism and violence. The path from a broken balance sheet to the guillotine was shockingly short. If you learned something, hit subscribe. Have a prosperous day.